Hello, everyone. Welcome, one and all. This is the Do Dissidents podcast. My name is Keaton Weiss, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming back to the show a staff writer at the great Jacobin magazine and co-author, along with Micah Utricht, of the great new book called Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism. Meagan Day. Meagan, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Of course, absolutely. So, I want to jump right into this book because you actually told me the last time we spoke that you were working on a book, and obviously, we hoped that things had worked out a little better for the Bernie campaign, but I think it was pretty cool that you were working on this book about where to go from the Sanders campaign while not knowing how it would turn out. And one of the reasons that I backed Bernie as strongly as I did from way early on. And one of the big things I would use to get people who were, undecided because it was a crowded field or whatever, I would say, the way that Bernie is building this campaign is such that there's a bigger thing here. There's a movement nature to this campaign such that you could really feel like you're building towards something that will survive or transcend an unfortunate electoral outcome. And that to me was one of the real points of joining the campaign early on. That was back when, he was mired in like the mid-teens in the polls, right? We didn't know he was going to get to basically within 36 hours of clinching the nomination, which he did. And so, I thought that was really the reason, among many others, but that was a big part of why I decided to support the campaign. And you were one of the people who kind of made me recognize that early on, that there's a mass politics element to this campaign that's there, I think, in an even bigger way than it was 4 years ago. And so I know it's a boring question. Like, what made you decide to write the book, right? It's a boring question, but like, was that one of the things that made you guys think, okay, we should document this?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So Bernie Sanders' support base is functionally different than the support bases of other candidates who see their electing their candidate as like a single act, whereas Bernie Sanders supporters, not all of them, some people just kind of like the guy and are not super involved, but he has so many passionate supporters who see it as one in a long string of actions and are also gaming out separate scenarios, such as if Bernie doesn't win, we still want to fight for the platform demands that he's put forward, and we still want to build a movement non-electorally, which we were going to have to do if Bernie won anyway, to place pressure on the state. And there's just a mass consciousness and awareness among Bernie supporters of these kinds of ideas. And so, but it's relatively inchoate. So we wanted to write a book that put some guidelines together about how people might proceed going forward, just something a little bit more concrete, because you're likely to hear, and we knew that if this moment came, that you would be likely to hear, like, keep the political revolution going, like not me, us has really just become us. I mean, there's a lot of that spirit in Bernie's support base, but not a lot of concrete ideas about what to do next. Mike and I have very specific ideas about what we think should happen, and we don't expect Bernie's entire base to agree with us. But I think part of writing the book was hoping to open up a broader conversation, because then if people don't agree with, for example, one of the strategies we put forward, which is the dirty break strategy, then that invites a new conversation about how this movement is going to relate to the Democratic Party, rather than platitudes, which can eventually lead to demoralization when you don't have a sense of direction. So a lot of the impetus for writing the book was just to like deliver one version of a roadmap. Obviously, we believe in what we wrote and we are advocating for it genuinely. And it's also the case that we understand that a lot of Bernie supporters might not agree with us. But we needed something, like we needed to put forward some vision for where Bernie supporters go next. And so far, it's been received really well. A lot of very passionate Bernie supporters have been reading it and indicating to us in one way or another that it has helped them feel more optimistic about the present moment and more empowered to do something next. I mean, just that there are next steps that they can follow. Primarily, the next step I think that we wanted people to come away with, if they haven't yet, is to join a socialist organization. That is, of course, only if they are I mean, you must be of the opinion that socialism is a better way to organize society than capitalism. But if you got that one down, then you got to join a socialist organization, and that's next on your agenda. Yeah, so we were hoping to give people a roadmap to follow and some concrete steps to either implement or disagree with vociferously and tell us instead what they would like to implement.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I would like for you to talk a little bit more in depth about this dirty break strategy because now, obviously, and, especially because of the way things happened, right? Like, so we didn't know a year ago if Bernie was going to win the nomination or if he was going to just kind of stay in like fourth or fifth place where he was, at the time. And even through the midsummer, he was, in the teens in support. We didn't know that he would get so close only to have the Democratic power structure coalesce in a Monday Night Massacre 36 hours before Super Tuesday and basically get the Democratic voter base to sort of do exactly what they wanted them to do, which is to vote for Joe Biden. And so that I think the realization that, wow, so much of this party's voters, right? For we don't even have to talk about Pelosi or Tom Perez or anything like that. So many of these parties' voters are so under the thumb of the corporate media and the Democratic leadership that people have just lost a lot of faith in the party as even a viable vehicle to push this movement forward, or a viable vessel, I should say, more than a vehicle. So that's somewhat where I am. I mean, look, we had Jeff Weaver today just announced they're starting a pro-Biden Super PAC, right? A couple of the Bernie campaign ads, right? So, so far, the post-Bernie campaign on the part of the people high up within it, including Bernie himself, quite frankly, has not been very impressive to me. But we may be stuck with this Democratic Party ballot line, as you guys talk about in the book, as part of a dirty break. So do you want to just talk a little bit about that, what that dirty break strategy is, and how maybe, I shouldn't say the approach has changed, but like, how do you think about that in terms of what we know right now, given the way things have transpired in the last, literally 6-7 weeks?
I mean, I hope that people are looking at the recent unfolding of events and are having the same reaction that you are, which is dawning awareness, if it hadn't already dawned. I've spoken to you before, I'm sure it already had, but, at least a crystallizing awareness that the Democratic Party is garbage. I mean, it's not a working class party, and it is not a party that has the interests of the vast majority of people at heart. So the Democratic Party is a cross-class coalition. And the reason why this is something that's very dangerous in the context of a party is that if you have a party that is attempting very weakly, I should say, very tepidly, to unite people theoretically across class lines, then what you really have is a party that, when push comes to shove, is going to listen to the more powerful of its constituents, because these classes, their interests are diametrically opposed to one another. It's like if workers want a higher wage, that's money that's coming out of the profits of the other constituency in the party, which is the capitalists in the party. The same is true for insurance. If workers want Medicare for all, that's a diametrically opposed to the interests of the insurance companies that make up a constituency within the party. And the same is true for real estate. People are struggling with housing prices, and you've got real estate giants in the Democratic Party coalition. You've got groups that have diametrically opposed interests to each other inside of the party coalition, which means there's always a conflict. And the Democratic Party is, as a cross-class coalition, the stronger of the two parties is always going to win out at the end of the day. Now, the Democrats, of course, they need working class votes in order to actually win stuff. So they have to, make overtures, and they have to make sure that they don't lose too much of their working class support base. But they're just towing the line. They're just seeing how much of it they can allow to atrophy and how much they can ignore their working class support base in favor of their ruling class donor base. They're just kind of seeing how much they can get away with. And there's a tug of war sort of constantly occurring, and the capitalist class elements of the party are much stronger on that tug of war. So that's a problem, because if we actually want to implement a pro-worker agenda, Medicare for all, tuition-free college and trade school, student and medical debt cancellation, something like a homes guarantee, a Green New Deal with a federal jobs guarantee, doubling union membership in the course of a single term, which I believe was Bernie's sort of oath, repealing Taft-Hartley and so on. These are this agenda has to go through a constituency inside of the Democratic Party in order to become realized, which means that you have to fight your own party to implement your own agenda. And that's not an advantageous place to be negotiating from or to be fighting from our perspective, right? So therefore, we argue that the Democratic Party is, as it's currently constituted, it's not like really a useful party for us. We need to abandon it. However, it's easier said than done, right? Like you touched on. Once you realize that, and I think I personally came to that realization many years ago, and it's like you go through a process. Like you realize it and you're full of disgust and rage and you want to get as far away from the Democrats as possible. In my case, that led me to join DSA. I wasn't a registered Democrat. I live in California. So there was a period of time when I just was a DSA member and I had believed myself to have like washed my hands of the Democratic Party, and man, it felt good because fuck them, right?
Oh yeah.
But then, unfortunately, you start to the further into the socialist project that you get, you start to then realize that you have to problem solve around this question of your own marginality, and the idea of a dirty break is what is opposed. It's opposed to the idea of a clean break. So clean break is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically, we don't like the Democrats, goodbye. We don't run on the Democratic Party ballot line. We don't call ourselves Democrats. We call anyone who's a Democrat a sheepdog or a traitor or whatever. And I think it's probably very, very satisfying to go that route. But I also think that if Bernie Sanders's current base were to, if like a very vocal and passionate segment of it were to do that right now, because you know that you couldn't get all of Bernie's base to do that right now. So if a passionate and vocal segment were to go start a new party this summer, which I don't even think that there's the institutional ability to do that, to be quite honest, but if that were to happen, don't you think that I feel that the Democrats that we've been antagonizing for the last 5 years would breathe an enormous sigh of relief because we've basically taken our ball and gone home. So the thing is, we want to figure out how to make a break that doesn't actually make us irrelevant. We don't want to accidentally make our own selves irrelevant because we were premature in making a break. The strategy that we put forward is, run class struggle candidates, run them ideally as DSA candidates, have them be identifying publicly as DSA candidates and not as Democrats, have them be antagonistic to Democrats, but have them use the Democratic Party ballot line because, who can stop them? I mean, maybe the Democrats will come up with a clever way to block our entryism, but then again, that would be a big public fight, which we would enjoy because it would heighten the contradictions in the party.
Well, that public fight is starting in a way. I don't know if you read in the New York Times. I think a couple of other outlets covered it, but I think Pete Buttigieg is starting his own PAC called Win the Era. The Win the Era PAC, which is going to focus on, cultivating a new crop of down ballot corporate tool douchebags like him, and they're going to, I guess the whole point of doing this, run against the candidates by, they're being put up by organizations like Justice Democrats, Local Berniecrats, Our Revolution, that sort of thing. So that's already, that could be right around the corner.
Mm-hmm. And I think we should not flinch from it just because we rightly understand that the Democrats are not where our future lies. We have to, people will say, well, it's never been possible for socialists to achieve their ambitions or their goals in a significant way through the Democratic Party. And they're not wrong. But unfortunately, it's also never been possible for socialists to achieve their ambitions and their dreams through third parties in the United States. That just hasn't happened yet. So nobody can really put any points on the board. And I think that's really important and a really important place to start from when we're talking about what strategy we should pursue. I want to clarify that the dirty break strategy is different from the realignment strategy. The realignment often refers to the idea that we can sort of reform from the Democratic Party to make it be an effective tool for our agenda. And I hope that I've explained effectively why I don't think that'll happen. And I'll add another point to that, which is that, either even some very intelligent socialists who I happen to disagree with on this question, who believe it might be possible to basically stage a hostile takeover of the Democratic Party and force the capitalist class elements out. So they sort of agree with my analysis of why a cross-class coalition is worthless, but they think that it might be possible to sort of spook the capitalists into, going off to the Republican Party or starting their own party. I personally don't think this is likely, because I think that it's really of an arrangement for the capitalist class in the United States to have two major parties at its disposal, because it can sort of pit them against each other and kind of obfuscate class lines. And so I think that if they're clever, and we know that capitalists are clever, they're not going to actually want to do that for strategic purposes. They're not just going to get scared because we're starting to win some elections and then get frustrated and stomp off. I mean, I think they're a little more strategic than that. So my guess is that they're not vacating the Democratic Party anytime soon. So the goal is to build up our forces. Well, I think that we should run as independents where it's possible, by the way. I don't think that we should always run on the Democratic Party ballot line. Bernie was an independent for decades. I think that's great.
Sure.
But where we think that we literally are not going to get any eyeballs on our campaigns and no one's going to care about us unless we have a D next to our name, let's just put the D next to our name, and then let's run out and proud, unabashed socialist campaigns that antagonize the Democrats and that draw attention to the class nature of the Democratic Party. The purpose being to build up a constituency that we feel confident is big enough to actually follow us into a third party formation when we think it's feasible to do that. And I would also add as a final note that I don't think we're ready to do that unless we can confidently say that not only can we take a portion of the Democratic Party's base, but we can also pull in a portion of non-voters in this country. And I would like to see some evidence before we're really ready to effect a break. First of all, I really think that we should have labor union support, and ideally that labor unions would be stronger than they are so that their support means more. But then I also think that I'd like to see evidence that we could even peel off some of the Republicans' working class base, which they don't deserve anyway. So if we start to see that all of that is possible, then I think it's possible to make a break and have it not be just a massive self-own that we did just because we wanted to make a point, however correct that point may be at the end of the day.
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And one of the ideas that I've floated just on this podcast, and I haven't had a chance to really interview anyone about this yet and pitch it to them. So I guess I'll pitch it to you. What do you think of the idea of having an independent electoral structure? I mean, you guys quoted Eugene Debs as thinking that is necessary. I think he put it almost precisely that way, right? Having a structure set up outside of the major parties, that we can then run candidates inside the Democratic Party on that ballot line, but get some sort of commitment from them that should they lose that primary, they don't just fall in line and endorse the nominee, right, and unite the party, right, but that there's a place where they can go that maybe even has ballot access who will give them their ballot line, so that you could literally run leverage campaigns within the party and say, okay, I'm going to try this in this party here, but if I fail, I'm not endorsing whatever stooge beats me. There's a place where I could go and I can basically ruin this race for you. I can take 15% of my people who will not fall in line behind the eventual nominee. I think of the Cisneros race that she ran in Texas. She got about 40,000 votes in that race against Henry Cuellar. And, if there were a viable third party that would give her ballot line when she lost, okay, I'm going to take my 40,000 voters, and not all of them are going to go with me. Most of them will probably vote for the nominee, in the fall. But maybe 10,000 of them will come with me. And that's how you start getting tens of thousands of votes into this new party. And if you can duplicate that throughout the country, that becomes hundreds of thousands or perhaps even millions, And I think that may be a way to fast track this. I mean, what do you think?
I think that I like it, except that I also want to introduce a problem with it, which is that when you talk about leverage and like I can destroy your campaign, that's like both something that we like and want and are going to need to use at a certain point, and we have to be really aware of the fact that that the spoiler effect has traditionally turned people off of third parties and made them not only afraid to vote for third parties, but actually caused them to revile third parties, which has been, an unintended consequence and is one of the most clever aspects of the partisan design in the United States is that it's so tight that yes, an independent third party tends to be understood as stealing votes from one of the two major parties, and that can be very troubling to the voter base of that party. And the problem is that those voters, we don't want them to dislike us because we need to steal them into our party. So you end up with a little bit of a PR problem when you're doing that, when you're playing that leverage game. But what if, and I'm just like riffing here because your idea is good and it's not something that I've actually heard articulated that way before, and I'm glad that you're bringing it up. But what if we're just actually running independents, or rather candidates are running themselves as independents, and they have the backing of an organization that was backing them no matter what. So like say for instance, DSA could run DSA candidates in the Democratic Party ballot line. And then as a strategy, DSA says, and we haven't discussed this at any point, and I'm not really sure what people would think about it, but, or maybe it's case by case basis, but we start encouraging people when they lose those Democratic Party primaries to go ahead and rerun themselves as independents with the exact same infrastructure backing from DSA that they had and that they built up in the course of their primary run. That way we're avoiding the spoiler effect because it's an independent run. It's not like a party stealing from the other two parties. And most of the blame, if people want to get mad about spoilers, would just fall to the candidate. But also DSA's presence remains constant throughout that, and we're able to, build up a kind of like trusted brand without the same spoiler effect problem. Does that help circumvent the spoiler effect problem at all? That's my goal with that idea.
Okay, so you're talking about like running them in the next race. So in other words, not turning around and running in the fall.
No, turn around and run in the fall as an independent. That's the idea that I had. Not on a third party.
Oh right, yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. Like, do you see what I mean? How that would like lessen the possibility that there is like some specter of a brand new third party that is playing spoiler. You could sort of like.
Oh, sure. No, I get you. Right. So they're not just like waiting in the wings for the Democrat to lose their primary and then take them on and spoil it. Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that
this is
totally
the kind of strategic thinking that we need to be thinking about. So the dirty break does require us to do this kind of thinking. That I'm glad that you brought that up. And like there are a million different considerations that we could go over forever, which I think are fascinating and necessary. But you see how this is already a much more nuanced conversation that requires a lot of strategy thinking than either realign the Democratic Party or like institute a clean break and do our own thing. And I actually think that usually when people end up on one side of that spectrum, like squarely, it's because they're thinking maybe more oh gosh, I don't know if this sounds rude, but I feel like people are more emotionally about what they would like to see happen. Like, I want to take over the Democratic Party because I feel like it's my party and I feel like I've been robbed of my party, which I cherish, and I want to take it back for myself. That's like an emotional response that some people have and that leads them to the realignment strategy versus I just came to the conclusion that the Democrats are trash and I never want to see or talk to a Democrat again in my life, which can lead people to the clean break strategy. And it's just a lot harder to like sit down and think about how precisely we're going to make a non-premature break from the Democrats and actually build a party that's not just going to doom itself to irrelevance. So these are the kinds of conversations that we definitely need to be having, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the emotional, trauma that the Bernie people have gone through is more severe, even this time than last time. And this was a conversation that I had with many people, throughout this campaign, because we went in 2016, we kind of went in kind of assuming that it was kind of our party. I mean, I was never a registered Democrat, but like we didn't realize just how much they hate us last time around. We kind of learned that. This time, we kind of went in knowing they were going to try and stack the deck against us however they could, and but we also knew we had this base of support within it. So it was this threading of the needle the whole time, and I always thought, because there are a lot of hard left people who were pissed at Bernie from day one. Why are you humoring them with the Russiagate stuff? Why are you, going along with the impeachment? Like, why are you adopting this sort of hashtag resistance, I wouldn't want to say theme because he didn't stick to that, but he would throw them red meat on the
Sure.
debate stage. Donald Trump is the most corrupt, dangerous president, and he's inviting foreign interference in our election. It's and there are people who are really frustrated in that. And I always said, listen, chill, because 70% of this party's voters need to hear that. They need to hear that. They have this emotional thing. They're like junkies for that shit. They need to hear you trash Vladimir Putin. They need to hear you go after Donald Trump in these sort of superficial ways. Okay, so just chill. And we thought, at least I thought, that once we got to 30% in the polls, once we won those first three, primary contests, I thought, okay, it's not totally surprising that, Barack Obama is going to call Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar and say, get out and endorse Biden. We got to stop it. It wasn't surprising to me that they made that move. What was surprising to me is that it worked as well as it did. Because I figure, all right, we're at 30% now. All we need are two out of the remaining seven, two out of every seven remaining Democrat voters who haven't come to us yet. All we need is two out of those seven to say, all right, well, Bernie won the first three. Looks like he's going to be the guy. I guess we just got to jump on board, right? I was expecting much more of a bandwagon effect because that's what happens every time. And that didn't happen this time. And the reason it didn't happen this time is because there's such a hatred for Bernie and Bernie's movement at the top, and there's such lemmings at the bottom. The voters are part of the problem too. And that really makes you want to just say, fuck this, I'm out. And so I totally get that. I also think, though, what you're saying now is that, you do have to be careful about how you do it. And it's tough because, I'm definitely, Dem exiting. I'm not staying in the party. But the thing is, I'm obsessed with this shit. So, if the next AOC runs in my district, I could re-enter, and vote for her. And so I think it's a question of, how that happens. But I think, I think you guys deal with it very well in the book. But I think there's, so, one other thing that I wanted to ask you about this, and sorry, I went on kind of long there. You talk about how Clinton, called Medicare for All a pony, and, Rahm Emanuel writes in his op-eds that it's a pipe dream, and that certain people in this party have just sort of been beaten down into believing that. My question, though, is that do you think that those are the people who can be reached, or is it just the working class who are just more broadly beaten down by society into feeling that there's no real hope for them in electoral politics? Because, to me, when I was at the Bernie launch rally in Brooklyn on the way back to the subway, I went into, one of these old rundown newsstands just to grab a bottle of water. And there's, the old guy back there, just the real working stiffs, probably sits back there 14, 15 hours a day. And he tells me, I had my Bernie button on. He says, so what do you think? You think he can make it? And I said, well, we're going to do our best. And he says, he looks and he kind of shakes his head. He says, I don't think he can make it. I just think that they're going to, fuck him over again. And it was that's the kind of guy we can get. But that's not the kind of guy who reads the Rahm Emanuel op-eds and thinks, oh, Medicare for All is a pipe dream. Those are different voters. And how do we deal with that? Because it seems to me we can only really appeal to one of them, not both.
I think there's a spectrum between the kind of person who follows the career of Rahm Emanuel with great interest and a person
Right,
who
exactly.
genuinely believes that the political process has nothing to offer working people because he's seen time and again that that's been the case, and he's reached the very realistic conclusion that that's the way that it's always going to be. And I honestly think that we just need to find people, we need to catch people in their own process of remoralization. Okay, so let me explain this. There's a pervasive sense across that spectrum that political change is not possible. Some people are very ideologically bought into this because this is the kind of person who follows the career of Rahm Emanuel with great interest. These people are very ideologically bought into this and will actually reproduce this in social settings. They will make sure that they are telling other people that, you know, any kind of idealism or any kind of optimism or any kind of ambitious policy proposal is actually a pipe dream, because they have an identity. This is how they've coped. This is how they've learned to cope with the cruelties of contemporary life, is that they are a pragmatist and they are a realist. And if they can't live in a nice society that isn't riven by hardship and misery and inequality, then at least they can console themselves by being a shrewd and intelligent observer of the realities of this society. And that's just a personality type, actually. It's very common among conservative Democrats, especially older conservative Democrats.
And more working class, right? Because there are some who just have a class interest that sort of lends them to sort of pretend that they buy that shit, right?
I think it spans class, but I mean it depends on how like involved people are. I think this is common actually across class. Look, you could talk about, for example, like somebody's like you know, well-to-do, like upper middle class uncle who like has got a comfortable, you know, McMansion for himself somewhere. I mean, you could imagine him saying this shit like to you as well.
Sure,
You know what I
right.
mean?
That's what I
Because he
mean.
feels
Yeah.
good about himself. And then but you can also imagine that there are working class people who've managed to like, you know, that's how they manage to cope with like their own lives being you know
Right.
containing a fair deal of hardship and misery, right? Okay, so it spans class. It looks different in different class milieus, but that's one type. And then there's this other type which is like um like it's like genuine. It's more like less antagonistic. It's less about like putting other people in their places. It is sort of like Eeyore, like a little bit just like morose, like, God, I really wish it was different, but I just don't think it is. Which sounds a little bit more like this guy that you were talking about. Like he wasn't trying to like tell you, wag his finger at you and tell you that the world can't be different. He was just kind of feeling like, look, I wish it was different, but I've never seen any reason to hope. Okay, so there's a lot of these kinds of negative affects that are kind of span class, and that they're all kind of lots of different people feel them. And yet there's also a lot of swirling populist energy right now. And a lot of it is coming out of the Great Recession, because anger, interestingly, is something that can actually jog those negative affects and make people sort of set people in motion in search of something. And then if they hear something they like, then suddenly they can actually become remoralized. This is kind of why I think it's really critical to have a left political pole in a moment of a populist energy, because if people are set in motion by their own anger at injustice, not just sort of grinding expected misery, but just like a deep random injustice like the Great Recession and the sort of collapse of the economy, or for example like this exact crisis that we're facing right now, when they're
Absolutely.
set in motion by that kind of more shocking injustice rather than that pervasive sense of either pragmatism or just like your style pessimism, they're set in motion by this anger. And the first thing they encounter that speaks to that anger, their ears are going to perk up, and they're going to actually attach optimistically to whatever ideology is behind that. And the problem is that you have people set in motion in this way, and they encounter right wing populism, and they get really drawn into right wing politics. And if we don't have a viable left wing alternative out there for them, then we are guaranteeing that people are going to be coming out of pessimism through anger and into a new optimism that is a right wing optimism that is not going to work in our favor. So I think it's really critical to be able to put forward a positive left wing political vision to make people's ears perk up when they're starting to like when things are moving inside of them. We need to be able to meet them where they're at with left wing politics and be able to draw them in, or else they're going somewhere else.
Sure thing. Well, this is a perfect segue into the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the opportunity to build labor power in the wake of this pandemic. You interviewed Chris Smalls, and I've seen him interviewed on some YouTube shows. I read the piece that you wrote, when you spoke to him, and like when I see a guy like that, I think that's the next step. We need to mobilize people like that, because like I drive like rideshare part-time. I used to drive for, Uber and stuff, and I would pick people up at like wholesale grocery warehouses at 6 in the morning who did the 10 to 6 overnight, and they're going home to get the kids on the bus, and then the wife goes to work, and then they go to sleep, and then they have an hour or two with the family, and then they get the kids to sleep, the wife goes back to bed, they get ready to go to work. And it's like there's a certain powerlessness that sets in with people who are in that sort of just grind, and like they get it, they get what's going on, they don't buy that, universal health care is a pony or a pipe dream or anything like that. But at the same time, Bernie Sanders, it's like, all right, I like him, but he's a politician, that's not for us. But now, because there's been a shock to the system, I think there's an opportunity for people to really realize their power in ways that they haven't before. And so generally, I mean, what was your impression in talking to Chris, and do you think that there's potential there to really build and bring in non-voters? I mean, because a lot of warehouse workers who work the overnight, those are probably a lot of the non-voters that we need, and that are tough to get. Here's the other part of that: in Democratic primaries, because non-voters are not as likely to vote in primaries as they are in general elections. And if there's this party primary process, this sort of semifinal round that you have to get through in order to get to the, main event where you can actually take power, then that becomes a problem. But I think there's real potential there. And you've not just interviewed him, but you wrote one more piece about some immigrant workers in Florida. And so, like, you've been doing some work on this. What are just some impressions that you get from, talking to people right now, like in the last few weeks?
Absolutely. So to tie it back to my last comment about being able to intercept people when something is already stirring inside of them, I think that in general, that's actually like a guiding principle of socialist thinking about how to relate to the class more broadly, is like people experience people experience things in their lives that make them more open to ideology at times, and often those are very bad things. So we need to keep our ear out for opportunities to be able to meet people when something is happening inside of them, and give them, a new set of tools and political vocabulary to be able to take advantage of that, and push it in a sort of broadly socialist direction, right, or at least progressive direction. And elections are really good for that, because you can, sort of like a dragnet, you can get millions of people at once, because like if you're running for president, aren't just like on TV all the time, unless you're Bernie Sanders, then you're on TV all the time, but still Bernie is able to speak to millions and millions of people by running for president in a way that you can't. So it's kind of like I said, like a dragnet. You can just get a lot of people at once, and who knows what's going on in people's personal lives that may or may not make them more open to messages of the kind that Bernie Sanders has to offer. But electoral politics are not the be all end all of this by any means. The same principle you can bring to like the questions, for example, of what to do with around labor organizing in a crisis like this one. So the reality is that only 10% of American workers belong to unions. That means 90% of them don't. A lot of workers who are essential workers do belong to unions. So, for example, nurses and police officers belong to unions. Police unions are quite different from nurses unions in many ways. But then you have grocery store workers, and you've got Amazon warehouse workers, and they do not belong to unions by and large. But what's happening right now is that there's a mass uptick in workers' desire to organize, even though they don't have unions. And so it's incumbent on people like us, and I say us because, we're just like people who think about this stuff all the time, and we're dedicated, political interveners in one way or the other, to help intervene in that moment, to try to connect workers who are organizing in their workplace to the logistical support to be able to do that when they don't have a union that exists to help them theoretically do exactly that. So the way that I found Chris Smalls actually was that I had seen him quoted in one story. It was, I don't know, it was CNBC or something. It was just one story. And he hadn't sort of become a cause celebre yet. I mean, this was like before the walkout and before he was fired and before he was publicly smeared. So I just looked him up on Twitter, and I saw him reaching out. He was on Twitter. He was reaching out to politicians, dropping his phone number on Twitter, being like, call me. He's reaching out to reporters and politicians. He was organizing on his own on Twitter. And that's when I knew. I was like, well, I'm good. There, the phone number's right there. I'm going to call this guy. And, and of course, what I found on the other end was somebody who had something had been set in motion inside of him. A switch had been turned on, right? And like that's the kind of person that you want to locate if you're, for example, if you're a socialist organizer, which I was calling him in my capacity as a reporter, so that's different. But if you are, a socialist organizer, that's the kind of person that you want to locate in a moment like this to talk them through the process of actually building something durable out of this. Like first, you got to win your demands and protect yourself and your coworkers. But second, you need some kind of institution that's going to be there for you next year and the year after that and the year after that. To help with the recovery from the crisis, but also with this sort of daily realities of being a worker. So to that point, I just wanted to say that it's very, very heartening that there's this project called EWOC, the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee, that's been started up. And it is basically has put out, and Bernie Sanders pumped this out through his channels. He's not running anymore, but he's still got a lot of followers. And it's for the Democratic Socialists of America and one union, which is a relatively progressive and militant union. It's called the United Electrical Workers, and they endorsed Bernie Sanders really early. And actually, you were at that Brooklyn launch, so you saw that UE local president was there. Mm-hmm. He got the whole crowd to chant, strike, strike, strike. So that union and Democratic Socialists of America took advantage of the pandemic opportunity to basically create an operation to find all of the Chris Smallses out there, right? Like it's a Google form. It just is spread far and wide. And it basically says, if you don't have a union and you want to organize your coworkers, get in touch with us, because we're going to do a process of like going through the intakes and assessing the claims and connecting people to the logistical support that they need to make this happen. And not only is that a way for socialists to sort of embed themselves in and develop and the trust of the working class, which is on its own a good thing, but most importantly, to make sure that people like that, when this is the sort of theme of our conversation right now, people get set into motion on their own. You have to go and intercept them in that moment and turn them into permanent leaders. So turn them into people who are permanent, because they're getting remoralized by their own anger. They're going to get demoralized if you don't intercept them and give them something to believe in and some way to fight, some way that they can fight. So whether that's fighting through the Bernie Sanders campaign, which has intercepted millions of people in their moment of awakening out of pessimism and given them something to fight for and a means through which to fight. But it's the same thing if you do this like emergency workers organizing committee and you find all of those workers who don't have a union who are just finally desperate to organize their coworkers. You can get in touch with them, reach out to them, and actually turn them into people who can unionize their workplaces, for example. Give them a way to fight so that they don't get demoralized after whatever this feeling that's happening inside of them starts to subside.
Sure. And, I think there's also a danger of them being absorbed by a party structure that is not really committed to like their material well-being or, in that sort of way, which is why, I'm a little nervous about all this, very sort of enthusiastic, like unity behind Joe Biden that, Bernie has to call. Like, look, we knew he was going to endorse Joe Biden, and I don't hold that against him. But like to call in on a video call and like yuck it up with him and, and now they're doing a super PAC for him, some of the people on his campaign. I think that's a danger too, right? I mean, you do want to keep this sort of independent so you could do it on its own terms, no?
I agree. I think that we would want to minimize that if I'm not in Bernie Sanders' war rooms. I don't understand what pressures he must be experiencing from that. I mean, I'd like to be a fly on that wall and try to like figure out what the actual dynamics are that are causing him to like go appear on a Joe Biden live stream. But you know what? He did how many events did he do for Hillary? Like he did a ton.
40. Yeah.
He did like 40 events for Hillary Clinton. So I think that this is actually par for the course with him. I don't think we should be too surprised. And it sounds like you're not. But yes, in general, I mean, I think that I find very little fault in this world with Bernie Sanders, and I try to make sure that everybody knows that I'm not very quick to declare that he's, a traitor, has sold me out if I feel disappointed with him. But, I do think that given that he doesn't actually want to run for president again, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if he just kind of laid off chumming around with Biden. I mean, when he did that for Hillary, I almost got the impression that he was just trying to make sure that he wouldn't be blamed for her loss, which of course he was anyway, so that he could run
Right.
for president again. But if he's not going to run for president again, then maybe he should just cool it a little bit. I do think in some sense he wants to make sure that the left is not left holding the baggage. Like he wants to make sure he's covering his bases. Um, so that not just him but the broader left doesn't get blamed for if Joe Biden loses to Trump. That's just my guess on what he's thinking when he does that. But yes, you're right. I mean, and part of the dirty break strategy has to be figuring out what kind of lines that we wouldn't want our people to cross in terms of being fraternizing with the enemy, because you're right. Like if we sweep up all of these people, like if Bernie Sanders sweeps up all of these people in their moment when that thing inside of them, the anger has jostled something loose inside of them and they're coming awake, alive with anger, and now they're getting attached to Bernie Sanders. It's not ideal if those people end up feeling he ends up, as people like to say, he ends up sort of herding them back to the Democratic Party establishment. That said, to be honest, I actually feel like the vast majority of Bernie Sanders' base is just kind of politely ignoring this. Like, I don't think that he's like causing people to become very enthusiastic about Joe Biden, just like I don't think that he did for Hillary Clinton, to be honest.
Right.
So
And they ignored him
maybe
then
we don't have to
too.
worry about it. Yeah, maybe we don't
Uh,
have to worry about that nearly as much as I think it's okay to wring our hands about it, but I'm not sure that I'm seeing a mass phenomenon of newly radicalized people being de-radicalized by Bernie appearing on Joe Biden live streams.
Right, sure. I mean, that's a good point because when he stumped for Hillary, he'd be lucky to get like 300 people, in the run up to that, fall vote. Whereas, when he was doing his own rallies in the primary, he'd get, tens of thousands. So I think that that's a good point. The other thing, in terms of like, okay, yeah, we shouldn't let this be co-opted. But I think one of the things, though, that comes, especially now when everybody's locked in their home, we can't work, life stops. I think subconsciously it kind of sets a light bulb off of people's head that like all of this shit that we call like an economy, it's all just man-made. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like there's no natural, or it's not a law of nature that I get up and go to work for $11 an hour and come home exhausted. Like this is all an invention. And these are all choices that are made by certain people, and you can call that politics once you kind of center your thoughts in that way. But like these are all choices that we make, as a society, whether it's wages, whether it's how much to bail people out once they can't go to work, right? I mean, we have a fight over, okay, what is the payment going to be? Why is it $1,200? It's not a law of nature that it had to be $1,200. That was a negotiated amount. And so as long as there are negotiations, I think people, now that they're in the thick of it where they have to act, because the heat's turned up under them, they say, well, why can't we act? Why can't we be part of that negotiation?
And it's a shame that people are stuck in their houses, because right now the only people who are actually doing protests are people who don't believe that coronavirus is real or a real threat. And you know what? And I think that those protests have actually been enormously effective. So I feel a little jealous of their protests. Yeah, I'm really curious to see what's going to come out of this pandemic politically. I will say this. We are so lucky that Bernie Sanders ran for president. I wish that he had won, but the fact that Bernie Sanders has been front and center, I mean, to the best of their ability, they've tried to shuffle him out of front and center. The mainstream media has, I mean, but his ideas have been, I mean, you can't really avoid them. They become sort of like one of the major poles in the political discussion, and that is so important because crisis times, the right wing and the capitalist class and the conservative elements of the Democratic Party are all going to try to take advantage of the crisis to muscle through an agenda of either naked, cutthroat austerity and privatization or kindler, gentler austerity and privatization, right? And I think that when it's possible for people to safely leave their homes and congregate in the streets again, the likelihood that we are going to have people who are protesting on behalf of the working class and against that disaster capitalism agenda is much higher because we had Bernie Sanders basically holding down the fort and helping expand people's political imagination for the last year. And also, I mean, really frankly, for the last 5 years, for the last half decade. So I feel very grateful. And I think a lot of people are actually caught in their rage and grief. But I think that I had my rage and grief moment in 2016, and right now I'm feeling a lot of gratitude for Bernie Sanders having been able to hold it down. Because I think that if he hadn't been doing this, our country would have been sliding, careening toward the right in a way that we can't totally understand right now, because it didn't happen, because it's a counterfactual and a hypothetical. But like, can you imagine if we had no left electoral expression coming out of Occupy Wall Street, but the right wing had not just Tea Party, but then Donald Trump? I mean,
Oh, of course.
you know
Of
what I
course.
mean? Like, when I'm talking about intercepting people when their anger is setting something loose inside of them, if we had nobody there to intercept any people, our country would have just become a right populist hellhole. Like, I think it would have slid genuinely toward the fascism that liberals are constantly complaining that we're like currently experiencing. Like, I think that we actually would be much closer to that if Bernie Sanders hadn't been running, paradoxically, because of course all of these liberals think that Bernie Sanders is himself, fascist, just like Trump in one way or another.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, that's how they view mass politics as fascist, because they view mass movements as mobs that have to be crushed, no matter what their demands are. Like, they can't really see them in any other way, through any other
Right.
real lens. One last question that I have for you, because you were not on Twitter last time I talked to you, and now you are. And, I've been following you, and, it's amazing that you can come out of this thing, you sort of not blinded by rage when you have a Twitter account. Because I followed some of those battles, and I know and this is half of a question and half just thank you for fighting the fight in there, because you were like,
Thank
you were
you.
one of like my internet shrinks for this cycle. I have certain internet
I'm so glad
shrinks
to
when
hear
every
it.
election cycle. So yeah, if anybody wants to just feel like they're not so crazy, follow Meagan there, and you'll realize that there are other people there who think the way you do.
You
You
know,
can, but I haven't tweeted. I haven't tweeted in days, and you know why? It's because I honestly feel very tired. Like, the whole primary, that was like 8 months since I got back on Twitter. It was like feeling very embattled every single day. It's
Okay, so
crazy.
yeah.
It's not necessarily the best use of one's time personally, but also I hear a lot from people saying something similar to what you just said to me, which makes me think that it actually was a strategic and useful use of my time. So I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, you basically answered my question for me, so there you go. Excellent.
Good.
Well, I think we could wrap up. How can people buy the book without going through Amazon? I gotta just put that in there.
The best place to do it is actually the best place to do it is the Jacobin website. We would love it if you would go through Jacobin. jacobinmag.com/store/product/69. I didn't realize that till right now. Great
all right.
news.
Well, I'll put the link
Thanks,
on
boss
the
guy.
episode.
And then you can also go to Verso's website and buy the book.
All right. Well, Meagan, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for making the time. Much appreciated. I know you're super busy now.
No, thanks a lot. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Let me know when you want me to come back on.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, always welcome. And I'm sure there will be a good occasion for it sooner than later. So you could check out all of Meagan Day's writings at the great Jacobin magazine. The book, once again, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism is the book. And follow her on Twitter for sure. You can also follow us on SoundCloud, like us on Facebook, subscribe to the podcast on any podcast player. You can join the show at patreon.com and become a patron for as little as a dime a day, just $3 a month, and support what we're doing here. Also, submit your questions if you'd like to have your question answered on our Q&A podcast, which we are going to be bringing back next month, which is next week. You can submit those via email, duedissidents@gmail.com, on our WordPress website via the contact form, or in the comment section on any blog post. You can also PM them to us on Facebook, DM on Twitter, or just comment on any of the article posts or podcast links. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks once again to Meagan Day for coming on. Thank you for your support. We'll see you next time.